When Deputy Miller's cruiser pulled up to my property that Tuesday afternoon, he probably thought he'd be dealing with a routine neighbor dispute. What he found instead was Brenda Vance, the 62-year-old president of the Meadowbrook Crossing, HOA, trapped inside my reinforced goat pen, wailing like a banshee, while my prize-winning Nubian goat, Bessie, thoughtfully chewed on the strap of her designer handbag. I stood there calmly on my lawn, sipping my afternoon coffee, and said in the most even tone I could manage, Brenda decided to break into my property again to conduct what she calls an unauthorized livestock inspection. So, I figured she should get the full farm experience. My name is Daniel Hayes, and I'm a 45-year-old software developer who, 3 years ago, traded my cubicle for 5 acres of rolling farmland. My property sits right on the edge of Meadowbrook Crossing, one of those sprawling suburban HOA communities, where people pay a fortune for cookie-cutter houses and then spend their weekends measuring their neighbor's grass height with rulers. When I first bought the land, I thought living next to an HOA would be fine, since I wasn't actually a part of it. My farm predated the development by 50 years, a fact I had verified 3 times with the county. I was not, and never would, be subject to their rules. That should have been the end of it. But then I met Brenda Vance, and I learned that for some people, boundaries are merely suggestions. Brenda had been running the Meadowbrook HOA for 8 years with an iron fist wrapped in a pastel cardigan. She was the type who would measure fence heights at 6 a.m. on Saturdays and issue violations for bird feeders that were the wrong shade of brown. Her husband, Harold, barely spoke anymore, just nodded whenever she ranted about architectural compliance. The woman had turned a volunteer position into her personal kingdom, and she ruled it like a medieval despot with a laminating machine. The trouble started small, as these things always do. First came the letters, professionally printed, on HOA letterhead, informing me that my new chicken coop was violating their backyard structure guidelines. I politely responded via email, attaching a copy of my property deed and the county map showing I was not part of their HOA. She sent another letter, this time claiming my rooster's morning crow violated their noise ordinance. I sent back a copy of the county's Right to Farm Act, which protected agricultural sounds in this zone. Then she complained that my compost pile was creating an unsightly view from the walking trail that ran along our shared property line. That's when her personal reconnaissance missions began. I'd catch her with binoculars standing on a stepladder on her side of the fence, taking photos of my vegetable garden. She filed a formal complaint with the county, saying my greenhouse was an unpermitted structure. The inspector came out, checked my permits, which were all in order, and left shaking his head. She called animal control, claiming I was running an illegal petting zoo because she saw some neighborhood kids petting my goats through the fence. They came, saw my 4 friendly goats and dozen happy chickens, and told her to stop wasting their time. Then, Brenda discovered drones. She bought herself a $1,500 DJI model and started flying it over my property every morning at 7 a.m. sharp. The high-pitched buzzing would send my chickens into a panic, and my goats would run in frantic circles. After the 3rd day of this aerial assault, I introduced her drone to the focused high-pressure jet stream from my pressure washer. It was a surprisingly effective anti-aircraft measure. She called the police, but Deputy Miller just informed her that flying drones over private property without permission could be considered harassment and an invasion of privacy. The physical trespassing started about 6 months ago. I came home from the farmer's market to find Brenda in my greenhouse, taking photos of my tomato plants. She claimed she was checking for diseased plants that might spread to the community garden. I told her to leave immediately or I'd call the police. She left, but not before informing me that my heirloom tomatoes were not on the HOA's approved vegetation list. 2 weeks later, I caught her trying to measure my chicken coop with a tape measure at 5:30 in the morning. She said she needed to verify it met setback requirements. I reminded her, again, that her HOA rules didn't apply to my property. She actually had the audacity to sneer and say, everything affects property values, and I have a fiduciary duty to protect my community's investments. The 3rd time, she brought reinforcements. 3 other HOA board members joined her for what she called a formal inspection. They marched onto my property with clipboards and cameras like they were conducting a military operation. I was in the middle of feeding my animals when they walked right into my barn and started photographing my feed storage area. That's when I called Deputy Miller for the first time. He showed up, patiently explained trespassing laws to them, and suggested they leave immediately. Brenda left, but not before declaring that this wasn't over. After that incident, I installed a full security camera system covering every inch of my property line. I also put up new, larger no trespassing signs every 20 feet and installed powerful motion-activated floodlights. I thought, naively, that would be enough to deter her. I was wrong. The cameras started catching her sneaking onto my property at odd hours at 11 p.m. checking my compost bins with a flashlight. At dawn, photographing my chicken run from different angles. I saved every single video clip, meticulously building my file of evidence. The situation escalated when she started bringing what she called an environmental consultant, who was actually just her nephew, with a clipboard to document what she claimed were zoning violations. They would walk around my property like they owned it, taking soil samples and measuring distances between structures. I told them to leave multiple times and started calling the police each time they trespassed. Deputy Miller was getting tired of the calls and advised me to pursue a formal restraining order. I filed for it, but Brenda contested it, claiming she had legitimate HOA business that required her to inspect adjacent properties for compliance issues. The judge wasn't buying it and granted me a temporary restraining order, prohibiting her from coming within 50 feet of my property line. You'd think that would stop her. You'd be wrong. She started using telescopic lenses to photograph my property from the road. She hired a surveyor, hoping to find that my fence was a few inches on HOA land. It wasn't. She then tried to get the county to rezone my property as a commercial farm, which would have triggered different requirements. The county reminded her that my agricultural use was protected and predated the HOA's existence. Brenda's campaign of harassment reached its crescendo when she created a 50-page document she called the Meadowbrook Agricultural Impact Report. She printed it at her own expense and distributed it to all 200 homes in the HOA. It was a masterpiece of fear-mongering, claiming my small farm was decreasing property values, creating airborne health hazards, and attracting vermin. She even held a special meeting where she presented a slideshow of photos she'd taken of my property, most of them clearly taken from angles that proved she'd been trespassing. Several neighbors later told me they were embarrassed by her behavior, but no one wanted to challenge her directly. She was known for making life difficult for anyone who opposed her. The siege was relentless, and I knew I had to end it. I just needed her to make one more mistake. The breaking point, the final, glorious mistake, came on that Tuesday. I was at the grocery store when my security system sent an alert to my phone. I tapped the notification and watched in disbelief. The camera showed Brenda, followed by 2 other women I didn't recognize, climbing over my back fence with a stepladder. They were carrying what looked like testing equipment in sample containers. The timestamp showed they'd been on my property for 20 minutes already, walking through my vegetable garden and taking photos. I drove home immediately but stopped at the gate instead of pulling in. I didn't want to spook them. I sat in my truck and watched on my phone as they made their way toward my goat pen. I saw Brenda trying to take close-up pictures of my goat's hooves, claiming later she was documenting potential hoof rot that could spread disease. That's when I quietly got out of my truck and walked up behind them. They were all so focused on the goats, chattering about biohazards and improper containment, that they didn't hear me. I slipped the heavy reinforced metal latch on the pen gate, sliding the bolt home with a soft, satisfying thunk. The pen was built to keep my clever Nubian goats in, but it worked just as well to keep arrogant trespassers in. It was 8 feet high, made of heavy-duty wire mesh with a concrete footer to prevent digging and a wire roof to keep out climbing predators like coyotes. It was, for all intents and purposes, a cage. Brenda didn't notice at first, but when she tried to leave and found the gate locked, the panic set in immediately. She rattled the gate, her face contorting in a mask of rage and disbelief. She started screaming about false imprisonment and kidnapping. Her 2 companions, who turned out to be her cousin and a friend from a book club, just looked mortified. I calmly called 911. Yes, I said to the dispatcher, I'd like to report 3 trespassers on my property. I have them detained and am awaiting law enforcement. Then I pulled up a lawn chair, sipped my no-cold coffee, and waited for Deputy Miller to arrive. Inside the pen, Margaret alternated between threatening legal action and demanding to be released. My goats, meanwhile, seemed to think this was the best entertainment they'd had in months. My prize Nubian, Bessie, developed a particular interest in Margaret's designer handbag, tugging at the strap with her teeth. The others investigated the interesting new smells these intruders had brought into their space. One of them started nibbling on Brenda's shoelaces, which sent her into another round of shrieking about assault by livestock. When Deputy Miller arrived 15 minutes later, he took one long look at the scene, at me in my lawn chair, at the 2 embarrassed-looking women, and at Brenda, who was now trying to fend off a curious goat with her clipboard, and I could see him physically trying not to laugh. I showed him my phone with the security footage of them climbing over my fence, walking through my property, and entering various structures without permission. I also showed him the printed copy of the restraining order she was actively violating, along with a folder containing 24 previous trespassing incidents I had documented on video. Brenda tried to argue that I had committed false imprisonment. Deputy Miller patiently explained that property owners have the right to detain active trespassers until law enforcement arrives, especially when those trespassers are in violation of a court-issued restraining order. Her 2 companions immediately started apologizing, claiming Brenda had told them she had permission for official HOA business. They seemed genuinely shocked when they learned about the restraining order. As they were leading Brenda away in handcuffs, she was still shouting about her rights as an HOA president and how my illegal farm was destroying property values. Her mascara was running. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled with pieces of hay sticking out, and there were muddy hoof prints on her white designer pants where Bessie had stepped on her foot. The story made the local news that evening. The headline read, "HOA President Arrested for Trespassing on Local Farm, Detained by Goats." The news segment included snippets of my security footage. The story was picked up by national websites, and Brenda Vance became the poster child for HOA overreach. The criminal case moved forward quickly. Brenda was charged with criminal trespassing, violation of a restraining order, and harassment. Her two companions received plea deals for community service in exchange for testifying against her. The jury found her guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced her to 90 days in jail, suspended 2-3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service specifically at a local animal shelter, and ordered her to pay me $15,000 in damages for harassment and legal fees. But the real blow came during the emergency HOA board meeting held while she was still dealing with a criminal case. The community had had enough. In a vote of 178 to 12, Brenda was removed from her position as HOA president and banned from serving on any HOA committee for life. She stood up at the meeting with tears streaming down her face and shouted that they were making a huge mistake, that property values would plummet without her leadership. Security had to escort her out as she clutched her laminated copy of the HOA bylaws like a life preserver. 2 months later, a for sale sign went up in her yard, and she was gone. The reign of terror was finally over.